The day her husband died, they told her to pack up and leave, that the winter would kill her faster than the fever did him. But she didn't leave. She didn't cry either. She just stared at the floor like it was hiding something. It was the middle of October, and the cold was already clawing down the mountain. The woodpile was thin. The food was thinner, and her children were too young to know what starving sounded like. That slow, hollow hush of a house going quiet when nothing's cooking. No boots stomping in, no kettle screaming to fill the silence. Clara Bellmeyer hadn't been born tough. Folks around the settlement whispered she was a proper woman, raised in Kansas City with books and soft shoes. Too weak, they said, too soft, too polite, too plain. They'd only ever seen her trailing behind her husband, speaking in that quiet hush, like she was apologizing for her own breath. And when Henry took sick and passed in just 3 days, folks figured the children would be orphans by snowfall. She buried him in a shallow patch of dirt behind the barn, and didn't invite no preacher, no neighbors, not even the other widows. She did it herself, all alone, tamping down frozen clods of earth with the back of a shovel like she was packing flour in a barrel. The oldest boy, Jacob, stood there with red eyes and frozen fingers. The little one, Ruth, wouldn't stop asking if Papa was cold underground. 3 families offered to take the children. One man, a lumber hauler named Otis Merrow, offered to marry Clara by winter so she wouldn't be alone. He said it like charity, like a favor he was willing to do for the sake of Henry's name. Clara had stared at him so long without blinking he finally coughed and looked away. When she spoke, it wasn't polite anymore. "I ain't going nowhere, and I ain't yours." After that, no one came by. Not to help, not to ask, not to bother. And the snow came early. By the second week of November, Clara was pulling up floorboards, not to burn. She had enough sense not to start cannibalizing the house, but she pulled them up anyway, piece by piece, quiet as a grave digger, while the children slept in their coats. Her hands cracked open with the cold, bleeding into the wood. She stuffed rags in her palms and pried up more. Neighbors figured she was losing her mind. A couple of boys from the creek settlement saw through her window and said she'd gone ghost crazy, peeling up the floor like she was hunting something. But she wasn't lost. She wasn't mad. She was remembering something Henry once said in passing years ago when they first built the cabin together. "It ain't the snow that kills you," he'd muttered while nailing down a joist. "It's the floor. Cold rises straight up from the dirt. You want real warmth? Raise the floor. Trap the heat." Back then, she'd laughed. "You planning to float the house?" He shrugged. "Just saying. If you ever want a house to feel warm off a single log, you better trap every lick of heat underfoot." She hadn't thought on it again, not until she found herself huddled with 2 children under a wet quilt, shaking on that same floor. Not until she realized the fire was going out, and she only had 6 good logs left. Not until her breath curled against the rafters, like it wanted to escape. So she pulled it up, all of it, 1 beam at a time, and she started digging. They heard the pounding on the 3rd week of snow. Otis Merrow came by first, dragging a mule and acting like it was coincidence. Said he was hauling meat from a trapped elk, but his eyes kept drifting toward her windows, kept trying to peer over her shoulder. "What in blazes are you building, Clara?" She didn't answer, just wiped her brow and kept hammering. The children were behind her, laying in the corner near a small stove that glowed red-hot with just a whisper of fire inside. Otis frowned. That stove had never burned bright, even back when Henry fed it day and night. It was a useless old thing. Everyone said so. "How you keeping it so warm in there?" he asked, voice too casual. Clara didn't pause her hammer. "Same way you keep your house cold, with what I've got." He didn't like that. By mid-December, the snow was knee-deep, and the air was cutting through coats like knives. Half the settlement had taken to sleeping in barns or crowding into the general store where the walls were thicker. Fires burned around the clock, and still people coughed, teeth chattered, babies whimpered through the night. But the Bellmeyer cabin, it glowed. People saw the light through the storm, a warm, flickering amber that seemed unnatural in a home that should have frozen. Some claimed witchcraft. Others said Henry had left her gold. A few bitter men claimed she was burning furniture and risking her children's lungs just to keep up appearances. But the truth was simpler. Beneath her cabin, Clara had dug a trench, not wide, just enough for a person to crawl through. She laid old tin sheets like a tunnel, angled so the heat from the stove traveled under the house and circled back. She packed the walls with straw and burlap soaked in salt water, a trick she remembered from the root cellars back east. She raised the floor beams on bricks scavenged from a collapsed chimney and laid thick planks with no gaps. Then she lit a single log each night, just one, and it worked. The heat was caught. It circled, crept, stayed low. Her children slept barefoot, her breath no longer fogged in the mornings. And outside, the neighbors started watching closer. In January, something changed. A boy named Caleb from the Merrow farm came knocking, hat in hand. His mother had taken fever. His father wouldn't leave the stove. He asked, real polite, if maybe Clara had extra wood, or maybe a spot for a sick woman to lay a while. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't mock. She told the boy to go home. That she'd come by soon. Then she pulled on her coat, grabbed a pot of broth off her shelf, and started walking uphill in the dark. When she returned, her cheeks were red from wind and gratitude. Caleb had whispered something when she left, something she hadn't expected to hear from a child born to men who called her useless. He'd said, Pa was wrong. By early February, 3 more families sent word. They didn't ask for handouts. They asked to see the floor, to understand how she'd done it, to admit, in quiet shame, that the woman they thought too weak had outlasted them all and done it with less. But Clara didn't want their praise. She didn't care for apologies. What she wanted was simple, to show other women what she'd learned, to teach it so no child slept cold again, not if there was a way. So she showed them the tunnel, the salt-stuffed walls, the raised beams, the way a single log could heat more when the floor itself gave back the warmth. One by one, the other cabins started changing, and bit by bit, the mocking stopped. But the biggest shock, the part no one dared admit out loud, was this. Even with all their money, all their strength, all their pride, none of them had thought to raise the floor. None of them had listened to Henry that day he muttered it in passing. None of them had seen what Clara saw in silence, because it took the one they called weak to do what no man would. And when they finally saw it working, when children who'd been coughing now slept sound, and mothers cried from warmth instead of cold, they didn't laugh anymore. They watched her instead, and waited, because the worst snow was still coming. And they knew, in the pit of their stomachs, that they weren't ready. But she was. She had been for weeks. The worst snow came the night after a thaw, that bitter trick nature plays when folks start to believe maybe the season's easing up. Ice began to melt off the trees and patter softly down the sloped roofs like rain. The creek broke through its frozen crust and gurgled like spring was sniffing the valley's edges. Birds even chirped, once, twice, then stopped. The silence that followed was louder than a shout. By sundown, the wind shifted. Sky turned a bruised purple. The thaw turned back into frost so quick that the trees groaned from it. The snow came thick, choking, rolling like wool, torn straight from the belly of a cloud and dropped full upon the mountainside. It wasn't just a storm, it was a smothering, a punishment. And while most folks were still trying to patch shutters and soak blankets in oil to hold in heat, Clara was already below the floor, checking the tunnel for blockages, raking back ash to keep the heat low and slow. She'd learned the rhythm now. She knew how to make one log stretch into 12 hours of comfort, how to bank a fire so the embers stayed alive without biting through the wood in a flash of waste. Jacob stood watch at the stovepipe, making sure no smoke leaked too fast. Another trick, another layer of control. It was the kind of storm that kills, the kind that buries cabins past their rooflines and seals doors shut with crusted snowbanks that no man can break through without exhausting himself into sleep, and then death. And yet in the Bellmeyer cabin, Clara worked in shirt sleeves, sweat beading on her brow. The children napped on a braided rug with flushed cheeks. It was warmer than any house in the valley. That's when the pounding started, not from wind this time, but from fists, a hard, frantic knock, sharp and desperate, from the front porch, muffled by snow but loud enough to set Ruth to crying. Clara opened the door a crack and found 2 boys she didn't recognize. They were soaked through, one carrying the other, barely upright, both with eyes swollen from wind exposure. The stronger one spoke through blue lips. Please, Mama said you had heat. She didn't ask names, didn't ask where their mama was or why no one else was with them. She simply opened the door, ushered them inside, and put Ruth in Jacob's lap with a warning not to move. Then she stripped the frostbitten coats from the boys, checked their fingers for color, and pressed each child's hand close to the floorboards. Feel that? She asked the older one. He nodded, weeping without sound. That's what keeps you alive, not the fire, the floor. By morning, the valley was gone, just white, miles and miles of white, uninterrupted but for the bare tips of chimneys or treetops clawing up from underneath. The path to the general store had vanished. The schoolhouse bell tower was half submerged. Wind gusts tore away shingles and flung them like cards. And in most houses, the fires were either dead or roaring too fast, chewing through the last cords of wood stacked in pantries or piled in barns now buried. Otis Merrow's place went dark before noon. By sundown, 5 men had tied sacks around their legs and tried to trudge through the snow toward Clara's cabin. One turned back, one collapsed. The other 3 arrived, shivering, ashamed, and begging without words. Clara opened the door for them too. There were 12 people in the cabin by nightfall, most sitting shoulder to shoulder on the rug, heads bent low toward the floor, letting the strange, crawling warmth soak into them like sunlight. The stove burned steady, one log, no more. Word spread, even in silence, because out in that white void, when a cabin gave off heat, it glowed in ways no one could explain. The snow above melted slightly, formed a thin crust, and steamed faintly where breath escaped. It became a beacon. On the second day of the storm, 3 women came dragging children behind them, lashes frozen, boots torn. Their husbands had refused to come, pride most likely. But the mothers had known better. They pushed through blinding snow with blind instinct and found the cabin not by trail, but by feeling. They said they could feel warmth before they saw it. By then, Clara had run out of room. The house wasn't big, but she pulled up the last bit of flooring near the hearth, revealing the now widened trench that glowed like an open mouth, radiating heat like a lung. She spread blankets along the raised boards, built makeshift pallets, set schedules for tending the log. One log, just one, and asked nothing in return. The youngest child she took in that night was barely 2 years old. She slept without coughing. In the corner, Otis watched, quiet now, no longer trying to offer suggestions or make sense of it all, just watching Clara move, guide, tend. No one called her weak anymore. On the 4th day, the snow stopped. Silence again. But this time it was the holy kind. Not the silence of death, but of awe. Outside, the world was still a grave. Trees snapped. Barns collapsed. Fences crushed to splinters. But inside the Bellmeyer home, people stretched, stood, breathed. They were alive. Clara emerged first. She packed snow bricks with a spade, dug slow channels from the cabin door to the nearest roof peak. Then she stood atop her own steps and looked down the valley. Not a soul stirred from the other cabins. She knew what that meant, so she went back inside, gathered broth, and wrapped up 5 of the oldest children in every scarf she owned. Then she pointed them downhill. "You'll go house by house," she told them. "You knock. You don't wait. You tell them to come now, or they won't make it through the next freeze." The children hesitated. One boy asked, "What if they won't come?" Clara didn't blink. "Then you come back and we'll go to them." And they did. In the days that followed, it was no longer just the widow's floor they spoke of. It was her plan, her way of thinking, the way she rationed without seeming stingy, how she managed 12 mouths without panic, how she taught children how to check a stovepipe and keep fire from flashing. Men came now too, faces hollow from pride's starvation. They sat on her floor beside their wives and said nothing, just listening, soaking in warmth they hadn't earned, unsure what to make of it. One man finally said it out loud. "I ain't never met a woman who thought like this." "What kind of woman raises a floor instead of praying for heat?" Clara looked up slowly. "One who's done begging the world to change." No one answered, but heads nodded. February turned to March. The snow receded. When it was over, only 3 cabins in the valley had stoves left intact. Most had collapsed under weight or rot, and yet not a single soul had been lost who'd made it to Clara's house. The miracle, as they came to call it, was not in the log, nor the tunnel, nor even the raised floor. It was in the shame of the strong, watching the weak do what they never dared, seeing the one they pitied become the one they depended on, and worse, the one they admired. In the spring, a gathering was held, not a formal vote, not a council, just folks coming together outside the rebuilt church to talk. They wanted to ask Clara to speak, to teach, to lead. But when she stepped onto the platform, she didn't make a speech. She pointed to a girl in the crowd, 12, maybe 13, who had copied Clara's design and helped save 3 families by building a similar trench under her own house after learning from Jacob. "She's the reason I'm speaking now," Clara said, "because she learned, and she'll teach others. It don't matter who you are or what you were told you couldn't do. Learn, pass it on. Build floors that give back heat, and never let cold settle under your children again." That summer, no one rebuilt cabins the same way. Every house in the valley was raised, trenches were dug, tin was salvaged and laid down, dirt compacted, embers banked differently. One by one, homes became warmer, safer, smarter, and not a single man pretended it had been his idea, because they all remembered the snow, the fear, the pounding at the widow's door. They remembered the children sleeping barefoot on her floor, while grown men shivered. And they remembered what happened when the woman they mocked stood up. Spring didn't come easy. It never did on that side of the valley. The snow melted slow and ugly, turning trails into ankle-deep sludge and rotting the edges of every wooden beam that had survived the freeze. But it came, one shivering day at a time, and with it came something far stranger than warmth. Humility. There hadn't been humility in that part of the frontier for years. The settlers were all pride-fattened folks, men who built too wide and too quick women who'd been told to cook, clean, and bear silently, and children raised on stories of strength that never mentioned survival as a kind of genius. But the storm had cracked something open in them, and Clara Bellmeyer, without ever raising her voice or swinging a tool in anyone's sight, had become a splinter in the minds of every person who'd sat on her floor and thawed. She didn't want admiration, that much was clear. She never stood up at the meetings, never asked for a vote, never corrected the men who started calling her Mrs. Bellmeyer, with a tone now closer to respect than pity. She just kept moving, quietly, efficiently. She repaired her cabin first, not for herself, but to show others how to brace the eaves against snow load and how to vent the stovepipe so smoke curved low instead of rising fast and tipping off wind. Then she helped rebuild the Thompsons' place. They had 6 children and no man left, and the matriarch, Agnes, still carried frostbite scars across her left hand. Clara showed her how to stack straw for wall insulation, how to stitch burlap into a heat catch, how to raise joists using only broken fence posts and dirt mounded just right. The men tried not to look bothered, but it gnawed at them, especially Otis Merrow. He lingered often now, watched, said little, helped when asked, but his jaw stayed tight, his eyes always just a shade away from shame. He'd been the loudest voice calling Clara too weak, the one who offered to take her in, and now he'd slept through a storm under her roof, his children fed by her broth, his body warmed by a tunnel dug with hands he'd once called useless. So he stayed quiet, but quiet didn't mean peace. It was a Sunday when the argument broke out. After services, most folks lingered near the church steps. The preacher had gone soft that week, preaching a message of grace and rebirth. Folks weren't used to soft, not after a winter like that. They wanted fire. They wanted to hear that their suffering meant something, that it made them holy. So when it ended, there was a strange tension in the air, like everyone was carrying questions no one wanted to answer. Clara was standing beside the water barrels, refilling Ruth's canteen, when Otis approached. He held his hat in both hands like it was keeping him from boiling over. His eldest boy, Caleb, trailed behind him, eyes wide. "You planning to teach every woman in the valley how to rip up her floors?" Otis asked, loud enough for others to hear. Clara turned slowly. "If they ask, you're making men look like fools." That caught people's attention. Clara didn't flinch. "Didn't do that myself, Otis. Winter did." A few chuckles, low and nervous. Otis took a step closer. "You calling us cowards?" "I'm saying," Clara said carefully, "that pride don't heat a house. And a man who won't learn from a woman is a man who'd rather let his children freeze than admit he was wrong." Silence. Even the preacher blinked. Otis stood frozen for a second too long. Then he shoved his hat on his head and turned away. But the damage was done. That week, more women came knocking. They didn't bring tools. They brought questions. They wanted to know how Clara thought through things, how she knew what heat would do, how she kept from burning herself out while others leaned on her. She didn't have answers for that, not really. Just kept the fire small, she said, but steady. But what they really wanted wasn't instruction. It was permission to think, to change things, to take what worked and make it theirs. Not their husbands, not their fathers, but theirs. And Clara gave it. She opened her home again, not for the cold this time, but for the curious. She let them crawl under the floor, let them trace the tunnel with their fingers, let them see how it was angled to capture the fire's draft without sucking it all away. They took notes, made drawings, whispered about digging their own, and the men noticed. Some were embarrassed, some impressed, but a few were afraid. A group formed in secret. They called themselves the Keepers, said they were about preserving tradition, frontier ways, God's order, family values, but really, it was a knot of pride choking on the fact that a widow had done what none of them could. Otis didn't join at first. He lingered on the edges. He'd already been seen as weak for relying on her. He couldn't afford more shame. But when the Keepers started whispering that maybe Clara was getting too much influence, too much attention, he didn't argue. When they said someone should remind her of her place, he didn't correct them. And when they said she must have had help from outside, some unnatural knowledge, some witchy trickery, he stayed silent. They came at night, 7 men, faces wrapped, boots muffled with canvas. They didn't knock, just came through the trees and stood outside her cabin, hands stuffed with torches and rope, not to burn, not yet, just to threaten. Clara was still awake. She heard the crunch of snow, even weeks after the last storm, heard the whispering. She didn't scream, didn't wake the children. She opened the door with a shovel in her hand. "You bring work?" she asked flatly. They hesitated. One man, someone tall, stepped forward. "We're here to make sure you ain't poisoning the valley with tricks. You're not the Lord's order. You're a disturbance." Clara didn't move. "You're afraid." "No, ma'am. We're protecting our families." "By scaring a widow and her children?" He shifted. Another man grunted. Clara stepped onto the porch, shovel tip clinking against the wood. "You know what I did this winter?" she asked. "I didn't curse. I didn't cheat. I didn't steal. I used what I had. I remembered what my husband once said, and I used it. Silence. Y'all stood outside, mouths frozen, children crying. And I took you in. I did that without asking for a thing. And now you come here to what? Accuse me? Remind me I'm small? She leaned forward. You think I don't know I'm small? You think I didn't feel that every single night I had to keep my babies warm, with nothing but a whisper of fire and a prayer I'd run out of hope before I ran out of logs? Her voice broke. I know small. I lived it, but I made it work. And you, all of you, know damn well you'd be dead if I hadn't. The man shifted again. Clara's voice hardened. So go ahead, burn me if you have to, but you'll have to explain to every child in this valley why you killed the one soul who made it through that storm, with nothing but her flaw and her will. A pause, then one of them turned, then another. The tall man lingered a second longer, then followed. They didn't come again. But the story spread, and by June, Clara Bellmeyer was no longer just the widow. She was the woman who stared down men with fire in her throat, the one who saved a valley and stood her ground when it tried to swallow her for it. She didn't call herself a leader, never wore a badge, but women came to her now before they made decisions. Young girls quoted her words. Little boys carried stories about the floor tunnel like it was folklore. And one afternoon, a girl not more than 7 tugged on her sleeve and whispered, "Mama says I'm gonna be like you someday. I'm gonna save people." Clara didn't cry, but her hand shook when she touched the girl's head, because she knew, for the first time, that her strength wasn't just in surviving the storm, it was in how many others would now survive their own. Summer's green washed over the valley like a mercy that no one dared question. The snow was long gone, but the memories of it hadn't melted, not from the broken beams still lying in tangled piles behind ruined cabins, not from the bruises still mottling the skin of the frostbitten, and certainly not from the quiet, wordless way that men now looked toward the Bellmeyer house as if it were the true heart of the settlement. But with warmth came something else. Time to think, to remember, to reconsider all that had been said and unsaid in the cold. Some folks believed that with spring's return the world would right itself, that the order of things would settle back into its old grooves, that men would retake their places in the circle of decisions, that women would return to hearth and hush, that Clara Bellmeyer, the widow who dared to outlast winter with nothing but sense and shovel, would shrink back into her silence. But she didn't, she couldn't, because people kept coming, and not just from the valley anymore. It began with a rider, a stranger, clattering up the trail with cracked lips and a fevered brow. He'd heard of her from a trader who passed through weeks before, a wiry man who'd spent one night in the general store and left with stories that sounded half myth. The rider had traveled days to find her, carrying a torn map, a single change of clothes, and his sick wife, bundled in the back of a wagon with nothing but quilts and prayer keeping her alive. They'd been caught in a late freeze, lost their woodpile, lost 2 oxen, nearly lost each other. He wasn't looking for charity, he wanted knowledge. "How'd you do it?" he asked, still holding his hat like a man holding shame. "They say you kept 20 folks alive, that you heated your whole place with less wood than a man burns in a night. I didn't believe it, but now my wife is coughing blood, and I got nothing left to lose." Clara didn't ask questions. She told him to bring his wife inside. The cabin was quiet that week. Ruth and Jacob were out at the creek helping another family build their raised floor. Clara had room. While the man's wife lay trembling on her cot, Clara knelt by the hearth and showed the stranger the tunnel, showed him how to bank the coals just so, how to trap heat under a room without letting smoke choke it. She gave him a sketch, not drawn neat but drawn true. She sent him off with salt, straw, and more than enough know-how to save his wife, if he acted fast. He left before dawn, weeping softly as he went. By July, 3 more families had come, and that's when Clara realized the freeze hadn't just scarred her valley. It had torn across counties, crippled whole homesteads, and everywhere it went, it left behind the same question. How did she survive? The valley folk started calling it the floor gospel, not out of mockery, but from the way it spread, quietly, mouth to mouth, passed like sacred instruction. Husbands teaching wives, children correcting fathers, neighbors kneeling in dirt to sketch a tunnel, layout beside an open fire. Clara didn't name it. She didn't want a movement, but she couldn't ignore it either. Especially not when a preacher came. He arrived in a wagon painted black, with a silver cross bolted to the side like a badge, a traveling revivalist. He spoke with thunder and used words like miracle and divine heat. He claimed the storm had been a test, that Clara was chosen, that her floor was more than wood and air, that it had been a vessel for heavenly light. Clara met him barefoot on her porch, a broom in one hand. "I built a trench and packed it with tin. That's not heaven, that's memory." He smiled like he knew better. "But you remembered what others forgot. That's a kind of divine wisdom, Mom." Clara's mouth twitched. "Or maybe I was just desperate." The preacher grinned, unbothered. Desperation brings revelation. Will you let me preach from your steps? She thought about it, thought of the girls in town who needed courage more than they needed theology, then nodded. But she made him promise, no claiming her as a prophet, no calling her house a shrine, no twisting her pain into some sermon about order. The preacher agreed, and for once a man kept his word. That Sunday, 50 people gathered near the Bellmeyer home, some from the valley, some from beyond. Some walked 5 miles through heat and dust, just to see the cabin that hadn't frozen. The preacher stood beside the garden, hat off, and spoke with fire, but he never said Clara's name. She watched from the window, mixing dough with salt and cornmeal. She didn't need the praise. She was watching to see who listened. She saw girls straighten their backs, saw boys glance sideways at their sisters with something like awe, saw women lean forward, not in reverence, but in readiness. That was enough. It was Otis who broke the silence between them. It happened in late July after Ruth tripped in the garden and opened her knee. Clara had been kneeling in the dirt, cleaning the wound with river water, when a shadow fell across them. "I got balm," Otis said. Clara looked up. He held out a wrapped cloth. She took it. He knelt slowly beside her, not close, just near. "I was wrong," he said. "About you, about all of it." Clara didn't look at him, just pressed the cloth to Ruth's leg. Otis swallowed. "I wanted to feel big. When the world got small, I thought maybe if I made someone else smaller, I'd feel strong again." Ruth whimpered. Clara whispered to her daughter, but her voice stayed steady. "Making someone small only makes the world colder," she said. "You of all people should know that." Otis nodded. "I'm trying to learn." There was a long pause. Then Clara said, "Good," and nothing more. In August, the Valley held a gathering, a real one this time, formal. They planned to elect a new council to lead preparations for the coming winter. No more scrambling, no more surprises. They wanted to organize, to learn from what they'd lived through. Clara didn't attend the first meeting. She was busy showing a group of teenagers how to patch a wall using only dried mud and straw. But by the third gathering, they sent for her, not to speak, to decide. The council had 5 seats. One was vacant. They offered it to Clara. She refused. But she agreed to build a teaching hall, not for herself, for everyone. A place where knowledge wasn't hoarded or hushed, where floor tunnels and root cellars and banked fire techniques could be taught side by side with reading and arithmetic, where no child, girl or boy, would ever grow up believing that heat belonged only to the strong. They broke ground in September. It wasn't a fancy building, just 4 walls, a slanted roof, and wide floor beams already raised 3 feet above the ground. Clara helped pour the trench beneath it herself. Jacob laid the tin. Ruth painted the windows with blue chalk flowers. The first lesson taught there wasn't about fire. It was about shame, how it grows in silence, how it spreads in cold corners, how it can be mistaken for strength until it chokes a person half to death. Clara stood in front of 30 children and told them the truth. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was scared every day, but I moved anyway. I tried something. I listened to a memory, and it worked. That was the whole lesson, and it stuck." That winter, the valley didn't freeze. Even when the frost returned, later and gentler than before, the people were ready. Every home was raised, every tunnel dug. Firewood was rationed with care, used in rotation, shared when needed. No one knocked on Clara's door in desperation. They knocked with casseroles, with thanks, with questions about new designs, and offers to help expand the teaching hall. She never stopped being the widow, but now, the word meant something different. It meant the one who survived when others failed, the one who remembered, the one who raised a floor, and in doing so, raised everyone else. By midwinter, settlers from neighboring counties started visiting in small groups, not as guests, but as students. They brought gifts, dried fish, iron nails, tools, and left with sketches, measurements, and new ways of thinking. And always, they asked the same question. "Did you really raise the whole floor by yourself?" Clara never answered the way they wanted. She'd smile, nod toward Ruth or Jacob or the other women who helped, and say, "We did what we had to, that's all." But the truth, the quiet truth, was written into every beam of that house. The scarred knuckles, the sweat stains in the crawl space, the perfect slope of the tunnel. It had been her memory, her refusal, her need, and it was that refusal, to die, to yield, to accept what others said she couldn't do, that had saved them all. But not everyone was grateful. There were still whispers, from men too proud to change, from women taught to fear anything that smelled of difference. They didn't say it aloud, not anymore, not after the storm, but it came out in other ways. Rumors that Clara had been too cold to mourn her husband, claims that she must have had help from a man, hidden or ghostly, questions about what kind of woman builds with her hands instead of folding them in prayer. Clara didn't fight it. She didn't need to, because the proof was in the houses still standing, in the children who no longer coughed through the night, in the valley where no one burned more than a single log, and still woke warm. One night, as the frost curled around the cabin eaves, Ruth asked a question that Clara hadn't been ready for. "Will they ever stop mocking you?" Clara was stitching by lamplight. She paused, looked at her daughter's face, serious as any grown woman. "I don't know," she said honestly. "They might not. Even after you saved them, some people need to believe strength looks a certain way, sounds a certain way. They can't stomach that it came from someone quiet." "But why?" Clara smiled faintly. "Because it means they missed it when it mattered." Spring came again, brighter this time, earlier. The snow didn't linger, and the frost seemed softer, less like a threat and more like a memory testing how much they'd learned. The valley passed, and then, for the first time in its history, it grew. Families who'd lost everything elsewhere came to settle. They built raised cabins from the start, dug tunnels before they stacked chimneys, and they listened to the women when they spoke, not out of obligation but reverence. Clara didn't call it a legacy. She called it common sense. But to those who knew the truth, who had felt the heat rising from the floor when all hope had frozen, it was more than sense. It was salvation, wrapped in planks and patience. Years later, long after the last person who had mocked her was either gone or quieted by time, a book would be written by one of the valley children. It was plain-covered, hand-bound, and titled simply, "The Woman Who Raised the Floor." It didn't name every storm, it didn't glorify every struggle, but on the first page there was a single quote. They said, "She was too weak, but the heat came from below, and she was the one who laid the fire." That was how they remembered her. Not as a miracle, not as a myth, but as the one who stayed, the one who refused to run, the one who saw a problem beneath her feet, and instead of praying for the cold to stop, lifted the whole house to meet the heat halfway. And in doing so, made warmth a thing that could be taught, not just found, and that in the end was the greatest strength of all.